The third and final market failure we focus in on is known as a common property resource, which are non-excludable, but they are rival in consumption. So that it's non-excludable, meaning that once it's open to the public, everyone can use it, but they are now considered rival in production. So when actually someone uses this good or uses this service, everyone loses a little bit of satisfaction or utility because we all can't use it at the same exact time. And common property resources are going to be a little bit easier to think of examples of because these are things that we deal with our own everyday lives a little bit more often than public goods. So example, as you can see on the slide right here, are public festivals. So it's not excludable because it's open to the public, but they are rival in consumption if too many people use it. So if this one person right here who's taking a selfie is taking the best spot in order to take a picture, no one else can use that particular spot. So therefore, you lose a little satisfaction and utility from that. Other examples of common property resources, they include the beach. So if you go to the beach, same idea. It's open to the public, but if someone sets up on the sand on the very best spot to sunbathe, you no longer can use that spot, so therefore you lose satisfaction and utility. Therefore, it is seen as rival in consumption. Oceans, public parks, my ex-girlfriend, these are all other good examples of common property resources. So it fits the definition. A little bit crude of me to say, but it does fit the definition. It's not excludable because once it's open to everybody, everyone can use it. And once everyone uses it, you can lose a little bit of satisfaction from that. It's rival in consumption. So with all of this idea of the common property resources, it does lead us to a unique situation known as the tragedy of the commons, where we tend to overexploit and overuse these goods that are seen as common property resources. So let's go ahead and introduce the tragedy of the commons. Tragedy of the commons. So here, tragedy of the commons just tells us that these are resources owned by the community. Resources owned by the community, unity at large, meaning it belongs to the public, but they tend to be overexploited. So resources owned by the community at large and therefore tend to be overexploited. Therefore, tend to be overexploited. So essentially, it's a race to get yours before it runs out. So you want to get your share before anyone else can get theirs. So you go ahead and overexploit this particular resource or this particular good. And we see this quite a lot in the overall world. We see that there's going to be a lot of overfishing, especially. So who owns the oceans? And if there's not an international boundary drawn, that means fishermen are going to continue to fish as much sort of things that they can out of the ocean, because if they don't get this particular fish, then someone else will. So a lot of overfishing happens, and this is exactly where tragedy of the commons pops in. We have a lot of overhunting as well. So if you can't go ahead and shoot the best prize deer, someone else will. It is seen as a common property resource. And something that we are all familiar with are going to be highways. So highways, once again, we tend to drive way too much on our highways. If we don't drive on the roadway, then someone else is going to take our spot and get to point B faster than we will. So we want to go ahead and get to our destination as fast as we can, and therefore we tend to drive too much. So with all of this, we can go ahead and focus in on a little bit of a supply and demand analysis and see what happens to our welfare and efficiency when we have this tragedy of the commons or these common property resources. And let's go ahead and use that road congestion or that highways example. So suppose that we are initially operating at MC0 and D0, that intersection right there. And MC0 is exactly the tipping point of road congestion. So if one more person actually entered into the highway, then the entire highway would be congested, and we would have a lot of pollution, and it would take us very, very long to get to our destination. So suppose that you're driving on the Dolphin, Palmetto, 395, 595, or I-95, or the highway, or the turnpike here in Florida, in Miami. And suppose that if one more person entered into one of these particular highways, the entire highway becomes congested, and we have to sit in traffic for a very, very long time. But however, remember that people are very selfish, and they are acting in their own interest, so therefore this one additional worker or this one additional person is going to go ahead and go onto the highway because they don't care about you or I, and therefore when he or she does so, that's going to raise the marginal cost for everybody currently on the roadway. And when it raises the marginal cost, it tells us that we're going to have less efficiency and less welfare for all the drivers. So before, if we were operating at MC0, we had a decently large amount of consumer surplus. So that big triangle that we see being highlighted right here. However, if this one person drives on the highway, we become congested on the roadways. That reduces the consumer surplus for all the drivers, and we have less efficiency and less welfare. So essentially, as we have with the tragedy of the commons, with the common property resource, we tend to overexploit these goods and overexploit these resources. We tend to drive too much, we tend to overfish, overhunt, etc., etc. So what is going to be a solution that helps us get rid of this tragedy of the commons in order to ensure that we have the highest amount of consumer surplus possible? Well, there are a threefold solution. And once again, these are just sort of in theory. In order to do this in application, it's going to be a little bit more difficult. So number one is to establish some type of property rights. So the Coase theorem comes very much into play in order to solve this common property resource problem. So if we give the person some type of property rights, then we allow for some type of bargaining, we can help to reach the social amount of goods and services. Number two, we could have some type of government intervention while using government policy to restrict access to the common resource so we can't overexploit it. And then number three, creating informal organizations that restrict each user's benefits from the resource. So we actually have to go ahead and make the person feel the cost of him or her using the resource itself. We can raise the gas tax, we can subsidize alternative transportation, we can privatize toll roads. So here, using that highway example, if we can make that person feel some type of cost for you or I, or for him or her driving on the roadway by raising taxes, by making them pay some type of toll for using that roadway, then we can go ahead and not drive as much. So altogether, we have three different types of market failures. We have the common property resource, we have the externalities, and we have the public goods. And we took a closer look at a few of the idiosyncrasies within each of these market failures, and also a few of the solutions to help combat it. With all of this in mind, we're going to turn our attention to what we learned right here and apply it to what we want to talk about with environmental policy. So what exactly do economists view about the environment, and what is actually the socially optimal amount of pollution within the world? How exactly do we balance the current generation's outcomes versus the future outcomes, and where does the government have a role in that? So that's exactly where our next section and next few lectures are going to lead us.